All right, welcome back. We are now entering the phase of the meeting when we're going to have further deliberation on the evidence and take the CEPAC, Midwest CEPAC will take votes on clinical effectiveness, potential other benefits, and contextual considerations, and have discussion heading into our policy roundtable. So we are still thankful to have our patient experts, Paula and Claire, and we have our clinical experts available to the CEPAC as you guys continue to think through the evidence. So why don't we go ahead and go to the first voting question. And I'm just going to read it because we have to just make sure everybody has in mind what we're talking about as far as the patient population and the actual framing of the vote before we even talk about the evidence behind it. So for the patient population, it is women, and I would say what's meant by that is, again, all women or all people seeking relief from vasomotor symptoms associated with menopause. Is the currently available evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of treatment with fezolinetant is superior to that provided by no pharmacologic treatment, either prescription or non-prescription, for vasomotor symptoms associated with menopause? All right. So what I'd like to do is to invite Francesca to, again, briefly summarize the evidence and the rationale behind the ICER evidence rating, and then we can pick right up where the conversation left off this morning as you guys think about your votes on this question. Francesca?
Thank you, Steve. You can also refer to table 3 in the evidence packet. So in summary, the Skylight 1 and 2 trials, the 45 milligram arms, showed on average across the 2 trials, clinically important differences compared to placebo for vasomotor symptom severity, but not frequency. There was statistical significance for both. Across all of the trials, no serious harms were noted. However, there's no long-term data on efficacy. The trials were limited to a 12-week duration. And then we also had that discussion about lack of effect in the press release for the 30 milligram Moonlight trial, but maybe some effect of 30 milligrams, statistically significant effect in the Skylight trials. Again, most evidence showing severity impacted maybe more than frequency. ICER determined that there was a promising but inconclusive evidence of a net health benefit of fezolinetant in the treatment of vasomotor symptoms. And that, again, was based on some of the uncertainties mentioned and then lack of long-term efficacy and safety data.
Did you want to comment on the 52-week data that the company representative said was available?
Sure. Yes. And so there's a Moonlight extension arm and also Skylight 4, which looked at adverse side effects over 52 weeks. But we still felt that in comparing that to the duration of symptoms of menopause and the likely duration that women may be expected to take this therapy, that when we're talking about longer term, we're thinking about for the entire duration of use and treatment of menopausal symptoms. We heard one of our clinical experts say that, the length of severe symptoms was probably more like 4 years and overall duration about 9 years. And so even 52 weeks still puts us short of that.
So just to be clear, though, do we have access to the 52-week data?
We have some, again, preliminary results, not peer-reviewed, published pubs yet, but we do have access to some of that preliminary information that was presented, particularly from Skylight 4.
Okay.
And no serious adverse side effects noted. Some transient elevations in liver enzymes during the trial and side effects during the trial, but no long-term evidence of other harms during that year follow-up period.
Okay. Open to questions or comments. Again, clinical experts or patient experts, please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to say something too. And the CEPAC will obviously may have some questions for you guys. Does anybody have an opening question or statement they'd like to make about their thinking on this vote? All right, Albert?
Well, I'm just gonna talk through my thinking. I mean, the question is like a dichotomous answer, yes or no. and I'm trying to figure out how to respond when the answer is a graded, evidence is a graded response. So anyways, I'm just trying to think about is there an overall benefit or not, and trying to answer that question.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit, I think, about the way that you are pulling together or teasing apart the benefit, if you will, from the harms. It seems like human nature is to talk mainly about benefits as opposed to harms, even when, in a sense, both are part of the equation for overall effectiveness. But what you said is, I'm sure, what others on CEPAC are also thinking in their heads. Kurt?
Yeah, I completely understand the question, because it's compared to placebo in the placebo-controlled trial. I wonder, in real world situations, what percent of patients do not take pharmacologic therapy for moderate to severe VMS?
I can't remember if Chantel mentioned that specifically in her comments this morning, but I'll ask if either the clinical experts or patient experts happen to know the answer.
Well, I can just say that the majority of women aren't treated right now. At least we don't have great documentation with compounded hormone therapy, which a lot of women probably are using. But the usage rates have dropped substantially since publication of the WHI trials, from as high as about 40% of women using hormone therapy to about 4 to 6% now. So there still remains probably a large percentage of women, even with moderate to severe symptoms, that are not getting treated.
And
Yeah,
sorry, Stephanie, what percent or what additional percent are using SSRIs or other types of treatments?
I haven't seen an exact percentage of the SSRIs or the other non-hormonals. Deb, do you know that?
I don't. I don't think it's very large, but I do think you need to keep in mind the denominator too. Many of this 80% that's reported, many of those women find it. If you had a mild headache, you wouldn't take sumatriptan or something, right? You would do something else. And so a lot of women wear layers of clothes, they keep the windows open, blah, 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 and don't really want treatment. So it's really hard to tease out of the women who really, should be getting treated, how many are not because they're afraid of hormone therapy. I think it's a substantial number. It's higher than it ought to be, but I don't know what it is.
All right, thanks a lot. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Patient perspective, I would totally agree with that. I think that there's so many women, that myself included, that would just say, you know what, first of all, we've kind of normalized the suffering that goes along with this. And so we just kind of do the supplements or just do what we can, but hormone therapy has not been a consideration for most of us, for most of the people I know.
I concur with that as well. I mean, the majority of women automatically say even if they want hormone therapy in some instances or do it, their clinician will not prescribe it. Is the other thing that we get. So it's really hard to get at the numbers because women don't know that there's other solutions or what to do about it.
And, this comes because we know so much about hormone therapy, long-term hormone therapy, and we have these relatively smallish increased relative risks for bad outcomes. But in women in their 50s, this is what your model shows. In women between the ages of 50 and 60, those under baseline risks are so low that even a small increase is, has hardly any impact.
But that's not even the major barrier. The major barrier is that women and their providers aren't educated on hormone therapy. So as a result, they'll have many women that don't take it.
And what we've heard is negative.
Right.
So many of us think of the cancer risks. And if you're a Black female, for instance, you're a Black woman, you're thinking about, we have enough cancer risks. We already are at risk for everything and bearing, greater burden than others. Why would I subject myself to that when my mother was able to go through this with none of that? For instance,
I really look forward to picking up on that issue too in the policy roundtable when we talk about kind of communication and education and guidelines and other ways that this is going to be framed for women and clinicians going forward. There's going to be a lot of work there, I think. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a question maybe directed to the ICER review team. When you were working with the sponsor, were you getting any hints of problems in the conduct of the trials with high withdrawal rates? I know we don't have fully published data, so there's an issue with kind of transparency and murkiness, but you know, according to the sponsor, it's tied up in review right now, some of these publications. So, but for those that have seen the data, are there any, I guess, canaries in the coal mine here about what we might expect in the publications? And I'll mute and listen to response.
Okay.
I think that I can take that one. I think that's a tough one. You know, we don't know what we don't know, right? And so I think the only signal that there may be an issue, again, was what David was picking up on in response to the manufacturer comments about Moonlight being a negative trial, and then not hearing more about that, and then hearing from the manufacturer that that's not one of the trials that's under consideration for publication, and perhaps not part of the FDA submission. So that gave us some pause, but there were not other signals of anything else, nefarious going on with the trials so far that we could tell. But again, you don't know what you don't know. David or Grace, do you want to add anything else to that?
I would just add, we did ask the manufacturer several times for more data, and they declined to provide us with any more. So we did ask those questions of the manufacturer, and they were not willing to share at this point.
David, you go ahead.
I was just going to say the one other thing I'd comment on, their comment was made that it had only been a short period of time that Moonlight data had been available. That press release that Moonlight 1 was negative came out before ICER started its review. So, it's not like it was late in our review cycle that those data came along and we asked for them. We've been asking for them since day one.
And the trial was completed in April of 2022. So it's been many months since the trial was complete.
All right, more hands. Alan?
Yeah, and maybe this is more of a statement than a question, but others can comment as well in response or not. My reading of this question is what we're being asked to vote on is whether the evidence is adequate to make an assessment, not whether based on the available evidence, whether there is a net health benefit. And I know we've heard different perspectives on why the evidence may or may not be adequate at this point. Some of it may have to do with the timing of the assessment, and then other points about, evidence that could have been made available that have not been made yet. So either because they weren't disclosed or because they're not in peer-reviewed publications yet. But that is my interpretation of the question, is that we're being asked to vote on whether the evidence that's available now is adequate to make a determination, not what the determination is based on the evidence that is currently available.
No, actually, it is the latter.
Okay.
It is given the evidence now. So in a weird way, it is asking you two things. Is the evidence, it's asking you one thing. Based on the currently available evidence, is it adequate to demonstrate that it's superior to no treatment? And that could be that you have tons of great evidence and it all shows that it's no better. Or it could be that you have no evidence or very weak evidence and you can't tell. Both would lead you to say that you do not have the ability to say that with current evidence that it's superior to no treatment. Let me keep going on these. I think I just confused Claire though, but at least I could have, but Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, well, can I go back to Alvin's point though? I think
absolutely, sure.
What you just framed, Steve, is very different, because if an evidence report comes out and says that it shows no benefit, that's very different than there wasn't enough evidence to determine. So I would be very concerned about what Alan just raised and how that's interpreted, because in the final report, it's going to say there's no evidence. And then, but my original question was, because I don't know enough about this process. I'm sorry. What obligation are the manufacturers under to give ICER the study for going through the FDA process?
Well, they're under no obligation whatsoever. Under our academic and confidence protocol, we ask for evidence that we think would be helpful from them. And we often get evidence that is prior to publication because we are willing to maintain confidentiality around that in terms of its use in the economic model. So we do understand that there are some constraints around sharing some evidence. On the other hand, we all know that this is a long-term effort around increasing transparency around the data that are available so that everybody, patients and clinicians and everybody can see it to the extent possible. But they're under no formal obligation to share it with us, and the FDA is under no obligation to share it with the public.
Right. So, but then as it's framed here, it's like it's a negative thing that the manufacturer didn't pass along the data. But if they're trying to get FDA approval for something, wouldn't that be the priority? And then, you know, this review process, I mean, the FDA approval process is pretty rigorous. So wouldn't that be the secondary? I just sort of, again, and it could be my interpretation, but the comments that I'm hearing from the ICER team is that there was something nefarious about the manufacturer not providing the data. So I didn't know what that process was for how do you get it and what their obligation was to give you the latest data in time for your review versus in time for the FDA review.
Right. So again, they're under no obligation. I know we've talked about a little bit about the timeline and why it's set up to be working towards the date that the FDA is likely, or, you know, some people think more likely, some people think less likely to approve it. And it is because this is also, and we can talk about this during the policy roundtable, payers and others are already having their meetings around this, and they have to work with what data they can find in the public domain. And so they're going to be using that to make their coverage decisions, and they're going to use that to help their price negotiation. So that all happens in some cases months before the FDA approval is even expected. So admittedly, if we had the best of all worlds, you would wait, the FDA would have access to the data, then it would be all made publicly available. And maybe there would be a waiting phase of 6 to 12 months when the drug would be free or at cost or something. And, you know, there would be, but that's not the way the system works. So we kind of have this rush to judgment at the time of FDA approval when coverage, pricing, clinical guidelines are often also kind of stimulated by that first approval. So anyway, that's why we have to wrestle with the tension, but I would not use, I don't think any ICER staff person used it or characterized it as nefarious.
Sorry, that's just too strong a word. I just got to think like, oh, they had it, and they didn't give it to us. And so
it's just
like, why wouldn't they give it? Right? Why wouldn't they give it to you if they had it? They should, you know.
That is a reasonable question. And again, I don't want to overinterpret the answer other than to note that we do receive a fair amount of evidence that is in line for publication. And we have a general, I think, instinct, as a lot of bodies do, to encourage manufacturers to share all information, including those on negative studies, with the public. And so when we see that happening over 9 to 12 months or more and evidence hasn't been made available, it raises concerns that patients and doctors won't have all the evidence that they need to make a full decision. I see lots of hands, and I'm going to try, but thank you for your question. I hope I did a reasonable job of addressing it. I'll circle back through Alan, Ingva, and David, and then we might need to move ahead for a vote pretty soon after that. But Alan, go ahead. Or are you a residual hand up? Okay. Ingva, go ahead.
Yeah, just real quick. From my perspective, you know, when I hear liver function test abnormalities and talking about the unknowns, whenever we look at net benefit, we always have to think about how much of the downsides encroaches on that net benefit. And particularly when we have some uncertainty about both of those, we need to think through this. And although 2 to 4% is not unheard of for any drugs, this is not, you know, something that I usually feel like it's a huge concern initially. It's just the fact that the lower your benefit goes, that even putative harms start to weigh in at some point. And although that, again, is not completely unusual, in this specific case, I'm a little bit worried because we are potentially, we heard how many women are not treated. And we are potentially talking about something that could be taken by many, 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 many women very quickly, very early on, where you don't have the time to collect harms data quickly enough. This happened, for example, with cholesterol lowering medications, as you're probably aware, where a rollout of something that many people potentially will take could cause very rare instances of very severe liver damage to occur that we can't see in the enrolled number that we have right now. That is not true for, let's say, metastatic cancer, right? Because it's a much, much smaller group of people that start taking it over time, and then certain harm signals can be collected. I'm very worried in a setting like we have here right now that a small signal like that, 2 to 4%, could translate into some idiosyncratic reaction to the liver that we will potentially then see very quickly when there's a lot of women taking that medication. So for me, particularly when the benefits are uncertain, suddenly that harm signal that usually when there's a lot of benefit, I would take sort of as something that I'm willing to trade off. Now that trade-off becomes different. So just a quick comment on that. Thank you.
No, I'm glad you raised it. I was actually going to ask because I did not learn enough about the biochemistry, the pathophysiology. I shouldn't call it pathophysiology, but this new mechanism of action. You know, there are some new mechanisms of action which are new a little bit. It might just move up higher in a kind of a pathway that we're very familiar with. And other new mechanisms of action are really going after a new target, and we haven't had anything like it before. And so, you know, the slide presented today said it affects the hypothalamus, and then we have liver effects. And so can either of the clinical experts or Francesca, if you want, how would you characterize the newness of this mechanism of action, if you understand my meaning? How new is it?
It's new, but I don't have a clue. It sounds like it's having the supposed mechanism of action, and we're always fooled by this, right, is in the hypothalamus. So that's an important organ. But otherwise, I really don't know what other, collateral damage we might expect from this. This is why I was interested in knowing if there was, any possibility there might be an effect on the uterus.
Right.
I agree. This is a completely novel compound. We don't know anything about it. We don't know how it works. We don't know what other potential effects it might have or might not have. So cardiovascular, brain, bone, we just don't have any of that information.
All right, thanks.
Well, I can only chime in to say that the
Sure.
neurokinin receptors are located in a variety of tissues throughout the body. Neurons being one of them, but also exocrine tissue, smooth muscle. And so I think we're still learning about this. There's a variety of clinical trials underway looking at other like similar classes, but none of them are FDA approved. So we will learn more about this as it progresses.
Could I just add to this that, I like this principle that you should be careful when you're going to be giving a medication to millions of people, but I would add that you're going to be giving a medication to millions of people who are pretty much otherwise healthy. So the balance of potential, risk and benefit really should be clear.
All right. Thank you, David.
I just wanted to answer a little more to Claire about the trial that we don't have the results on at all. Isn't in line for publication, we just heard. It's not one of those 3 publications that's happening. And in asking for those data, often it's easier for a manufacturer to quickly give us some numbers, or even to do a press release about what the actual numbers were. So at some level, we have a negative trial. We have positive trials that haven't been published, but they put the numbers out there. And then we have a negative trial where they didn't put the numbers out there. And that's unusual. Usually we have access, I don't mean ICER has access, usually all of us have access to phase 3 trial results by now. And so it's at least a little concerning.
Kurt?
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the issue about the liver function tests, because I've been thinking about that as well. And granted, it's a small percentage, but because we don't have published data, I can't see the inclusion exclusion criteria. I guess putting my pharmacist hat on, I start wondering about drug interactions and other things that could happen in the real world situation, which could factor into potentially higher LFTs. I don't know if anyone has any information about drug interactions or not.
So it does interact with, I'd have to look at which CYP mechanism, but there is, and that was part of the exclusion criteria for for the trial that participants could not be on certain drugs that were, and I can pull it up and throw it in the chat just out of curiosity, but that was part of the criteria. And I believe SSRI, SNRIs might have been part of the exclusion as well, because of drug interaction. But that will be a consideration moving forward in terms of like who can actually take this medication, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions as people think about the evidence on this vote? Okay, why don't we go ahead and take a vote? Put the voting question back up again, please. And all right, so I believe there are 12 voting members of the CEPAC who've been able to be with us throughout the day. We've had 11 responses. As soon as we get to 12, we will show the result. There we go. Okay, we have 11 no's and 1 yes. All right, I think we've had a robust enough discussion around the evidence that we can move forward without further kind of exploration of the rationales behind the votes. So the second question asks you again about the same patient population, all women seeking relief from vasomotor symptoms associated with menopause. Now the question is the currently available evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit between fezolinetant and menopausal hormone therapy for vasomotor symptoms associated with menopause? Francesca, again, if you don't mind just briefly summarizing what the evidence is or isn't.
Yes. So again, I think we kind of we went over the fezolinetant information. So I'll summarize MHT and then the comparison of the two. Again, you can turn to that table 3, which has a breakdown for the different drugs. So on average, across 9 different studies, 10 trials, there was one that was nested. MHT resulted in both statistically and clinically significant improvements in vasomotor severity and frequency. That was compared to placebo. In comparing fezolinetant and MHT directly, there are no head-to-head trials, and there was really only one study that allowed us to make any indirect comparisons. And on average, MHT appears to perform better than fezolinetant. And so we felt that there was insufficient evidence because of lack of head-to-head trials and also heterogeneity of the trials that didn't allow us to make indirect comparisons. And so we rated it an I, insufficient evidence, and felt that it was likely that there was either that fezolinetant was either comparable or inferior to MHT was most likely.
Okay, any questions about that? All right, let's go ahead and take a vote. Put back up the voting question. Is the currently available evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit between the two, phenylizetant and menopausal hormone therapy? Go ahead and show the results. Okay, 12 no and 0 yes. All right. Moving ahead, we're into a different phase of the votes in which we're going to talk about contextual issues. Can you go ahead and go forward? Okay. So if you remember my opening around the different parts of value, part of it has to do with contextual considerations that I said are related to kind of ethical values that we sometimes attach to different health kind of situations. And one is around the severity of the illness and the acuity of the need. So let me read this question. It says, when making judgments of the overall long-term value for money, what's the relative priority that should be given to any effective treatment for vasomotor symptoms associated with menopause on the basis of the following contextual considerations? So let me just pause to say, we're not actually asking any more about whether fezolinetant has evidence adequate to say that it works or doesn't work, anything. We're really thinking about menopause, vasomotor symptoms of menopause. And whether, given the current treatments available, whether we think that there's a relative priority to any new treatment in this area, based on, in this case, the acuity of need for treatment of individual patients based on their short-term risk of death or progression to permanent disability. Why are we asking this question? This is a standard question that we ask of treatments, not of treatments, but of basically all conditions that are part of ICER reviews, because sometimes we are looking at conditions that are very rapidly fatal or that lead rapidly to permanent disability. And in some cases, people want to attach greater ethical weight to treatments that can help us in those situations. So here, again, we're asking a standard question in a context in which you may think it doesn't really apply because menopause is not going to kill anybody tomorrow, kind of situation. We'll talk more about lifetime burden and longer term burden in the next question. Do any members of the CEPAC have any question or comment they'd like to make about this before we vote? Okay, let's go ahead and vote. A is very low priority, all the way up to E, very high priority on the basis of et cetera. Okay, you've got it. 12 votes. Go ahead. All right, we've got 6 at very low, 4 at low, and 2 at average. All right, let's go to the next question. So here it's the same context. We're thinking about the condition, not so much the treatment itself. And how much priority would we give any effective treatment on the basis of the magnitude of the lifetime impact on individuals of the condition being treated? So here I'd like to invite the patient experts. Again, part of what you can help CEPAC understand is the diversity, but in this case, there's a question around, is this a big deal for a lot of people? The magnitude of the impact over how many years, how would you frame that for their understanding? Claire, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think as in most things with women's health, everything that has to do with pain, suffering, or things that women have to deal with are considered low priority. And so this menopause is the same. I think when we think about giving women an opportunity to be able to have a solution to symptoms that they're experiencing at menopause, most women would say it's very high. Not all women were going to want to take a treatment, as you said, but the idea of the impact on their life is very high. So again, if you're thinking about comparing it to risk of obviously, death or something like that is obviously it's not going to be as great a priority as something that deteriorates like, multiple sclerosis might. But again, this isn't it's not a disease. We're talking about symptoms that women experience at this time. So it's kind of hard to say. As far as quality of life, though, I've had women tell me multiple times that it was the worst thing they've ever gone through, even after giving birth. And so I think it's on par with that. And, so again, it's hard to look at the science behind what the efficacy might be versus what it actually does to the improvement of a woman's life. So I would just keep that in mind. Women, when told that there are potential other options that are therapeutic to, hormone replacement therapy, again, because of the misinformation, as we've already talked about what the the side effects of hormone replacement therapy are, then they're very interested. And that whole idea of, oh, I don't have to suffer through this becomes very, very engaging.
Great, thank you. Paula, go ahead.
I totally agree. As I mentioned before, we've kind of normalized, because it's been kind of a low priority. We're conditioned and to kind of normalize what we go through. But I think that with the proper education and with the presentation and education around better options, I think that would change. I think most of us would opt for an affordable option that's going to improve the quality of life for us, but we would have to be assured that taking it would not create the greater risk. And when we hear only the negatives, for instance, with the hormone therapies out there, we've been hearing about cancer risk, for instance. Well, when you look at that, it's like, yeah, I'll deal with the hot sweats. I'll deal with my hot flashes and so forth, rather than subject myself to greater risk for other things. So I totally agree.
All right.
Claire.
Deborah or Stephanie, I wonder if I can be provocative in a weird way and ask you, what would happen if hot flashes, to the degree that you see in your clinical practice, happen to men instead of women, or as well as women? What would be different about the world?
I think this would be a very different conversation. And, you know, just let me, a little bit of an aside, we have a publication under review right now, which should be published soon in a rather high impact journal that goes into the economic impact of untreated menopause symptoms and specifically hot flashes. And it's staggering what the economic impact is of untreated symptoms. So I think, you know, when we step back and have a bigger picture, this is affecting women. It's affecting their families. It's affecting their work lives. It's affecting society. It's affecting women's ability to retire with a good retirement. And it probably is creating an issue in the leadership pipeline. That may be why we have a leaky leadership pipeline for women in midlife. So the overall impact is enormous.
Thanks. Deborah, anything
I
you'd
would,
like to
yeah,
add?
I would add to that while I said that, okay, 80% of women may have hot flashes, but only maybe 40% of them really suffer from them. That's 40% of all women, right? So, I mean, that is a huge number if you're just talking about absolute numbers of people who could do with better treatment. I have a very good friend who's a male who said if men had menopause, we'd know everything about it. And one of the things we don't know about it is its mechanism of action, which was one of the reasons I was really interested in this drug, because there have been some really bad studies of the thermonuclear, this, you know, regulatory zones and so forth, but we really don't know the mechanism that results in this peripheral vasodilation. So yeah, if this happened to men, we'd have multiple treatments for it.
We might have a national institute for fill in the blank.
Well, the Department of Defense would have figured it out, probably.
Well, that's probably true too. It's a
And
readiness issue.
if I might add, I thought it was even funny that you said this would be kind of a provocative question, because amongst women, it is.
Yeah.
It's like we talk about that all the time.
It's exactly right.
All right, good. Albert and then Reem.
Yeah, I just had a question related to who we're answering the question for. So is it for the 40% of women that Dr. Grady talked about? Is it at the moment that they're having like the worst symptoms, which is transient, and then for a period of time in their life? Because that's a really it's different than thinking about the question across the entire menopausal age population.
Well, it does say it would make sense to think of it in context of women who are seeking treatment for their menopausal symptoms. And again, that's a wide range, as we've all known, today, ranging from what you could call not as severe to very, very troubling. I mean, honestly, when you think of having 12 episodes a day that make you sweat so much that you have to stop what you're doing, that sounds pretty troubling to me. All right, Reem and then Stephanie again.
Yeah, I want to highlight a point that was mentioned earlier again. It's also the timing of when this happened. Not that there is a good timing for a menopause symptom to happen at all, but it is at the peak of a woman's needed from all different directions. It's when parents are getting old, when kids are getting older and starting their lives, when women who work are actually at that intersection of potential leadership and moving to the next phase of their careers. And all of it happens at that same time with these symptoms and with all the psychological things that they have to go through that time. So I do think it's transient, but important to highlight that it happens at a very critical time as well.
Okay, great. All right, why don't we go ahead and go back to I'm sorry, Stephanie, did you want to chime in? Go ahead.
Yeah, one last comment. I mean, it's been stated a lot that these symptoms are transient, but I will also say there's a fair percentage of women in whom they last for a very long time and even well into their 70s. And so, I frequently have women coming to me who are in their 70s who are begging me for something. And keep in mind that might be a good place for this drug as well. We're not going to be starting hormone therapy for women who are much older, but it could be a consideration for that group. And it's not a small number.
Yeah, in the major trials like HERS and the WHI, women were asked about hot flash. These are women, with a mean age of about 68, and a good 10 or 15% of them still were bothered, by hot flashes.
20, almost a quarter of the women in our menopause clinic are over 60.
Okay.
Thank you for
All right.
mentioning.
Thank you very much for all of that. Why don't we go back to the voting question? And this one is on, again, when making judgments of the overall long-term value for money, what's the relative priority that should be given to any new effective treatment for vasomotor symptoms associated with menopause on the basis of on the magnitude of its lifetime impact on individual patients of this condition, from very low priority to very high priority. Go ahead and vote. Just a couple more people. Okay, show the results. Okay, we've got 2 low, 2 average, 7 high, and 1 very high. All right. So these results become part of our package of votes and policy recommendations, if you will. Now, the next several questions are, again, slightly different in the framing, because now we are asking about fezolinetant again. Here we're asking, based on your understanding of the relative effects of fezolinetant, and I understand that many of you voted that you did not think the evidence was adequate to say that it was better than nothing at this point. So factoring that in, your basis of your understanding of its relative effects versus no pharmacologic treatment on the next set of 3 questions on the following outcomes that we feel are broad and important in informing judgment of the overall long-term value for money. So the first is the relative effects of fezolinetant on patients' ability to achieve their major life goals related to education, work, or family life. And I actually think we had a great conversation when we were talking about the magnitude of the burden on this element of the broader effects of menopause, if you will. So now you're being asked not to say, yes, menopause as a standalone issue has a major effect on patients' ability to do things. It's whether the relative effects of fezolinetant have everything from a major negative effect to a major positive effect on patients' ability to achieve their major life goals. Does anybody feel like they need to ask a question about the framing of the vote? Don.
Yes, Steve, just a quick question. Does this notion of relative effects include consideration for adverse effects or not?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments anybody would like to make before this vote? Okay, let's go ahead and vote. Okay, based on the relative effects of fezolinetant, what is its ability to change patients' ability to achieve their major life goals? And they're the results. Sorry, that was very quick. 1 is minor positive. Sorry, am I getting this right? Yes, minor positive. No, minor negative is 1. 7 is no difference. 4 is minor positive. Okay. Going to the next question. It's about caregivers. Again, you can understand some of these questions are very, very relevant. For instance, in this case, for pediatric conditions. But certainly we can talk about whether menopause has a significant impact on caregivers. But again, here we'll be talking about the relative effects of fezolinetant on people with menopause and the indirect effects on caregivers. Claire or Paul or anybody else, do you have anything you'd like to say about the effect of having menopause on the family more broadly? Caregivers in this case?
It's not necessarily caregivers, but as Dr. Fabian said, there is a huge impact across the board on everyone associated in the family, matrix with that. And so I think that it does impact more than just the woman who's suffering from the symptoms, and coworkers and family life for sure. That's the biggest connection besides, work is more productivity, but relationship quality of life, it's the family connection that is the most difficult during menopause.
I agree. I was going to make that distinction or add the coworkers and the caregivers in that category with the caregivers, because I think that that's where you feel the greatest impact, one of the greatest impacts of it.
Okay. All right, great. Why don't we go back and vote on this question? All right, so thinking of the relative effects of fezolinetant versus no treatment, what about its effect on caregivers' quality of life and or their ability to achieve their life goals? Major negative to major positive. All right, you can show the results. All right, 11 no difference and 1 minor positive. All right, we've got one more of these kind of potential other benefits, if you will. And again, you may want, this is a standard question that we ask. So we're thinking again about the effects of fezolinetant versus no treatment. Does that have an impact on society's goal of reducing health inequities? Everything from a major negative effect to a major positive effect. So we haven't talked really that much yet about the prevalence of vasomotor symptoms, their severity in different kind of racial or ethnic or even socioeconomic groups. But let's talk about that for a second before we vote on this. You still have to think about whether, you know, fezolinetant will have a major impact on this. But Paula or Claire or clinical experts, would you like to say anything about how you think that, and by this, think about not just the CEPAC who are on this call, but if we're talking to the world out there, and that includes insurers, it includes guideline makers, it includes other drug companies thinking about whether to invest in this area, et cetera, what would you want them to know about health inequities in menopause and vasomotor symptoms?
This one is it's causing me to flip-flop a little, because now as I look at that, I would say it would be major because I'm looking at the impact. I think about how, you know, just the conversation we just had, the discussion points we just made about if this were a male, if males went through this, things would be different. It would look, you know, we know we wouldn't even have a need for this convening today. So I think as I look at it, I think it would be a major difference because, and it would help with health inequities, because we have such inequities when we look at how women's health is handled and treated. So I you know, this one has me kind of going a little.
I know. And then the questions are always bad if they ask you to do at least two or more mental kind of formulations. And one is around what you just said. The other is around, does fezolinetant make a big, you know, delta in how we would experience that in this country? So just to point out that we understand this is a complex, difficult question, but I'm glad you said what you did.
Yeah, and I think that's what you just explained my.
Yes.
Thank you.
I know.
I thought you were talking about disparities too, as far as in health equities amongst addressing the symptoms of minority populations that are different from white women in this space as well.
Yes.
And for all the reasons that Paula had shared earlier, there is an absolute need for new options for people who experience vasomotor symptoms in different ethnic groups. And I know that, you know, the Black Women's Health Imperative had shared theirs, but, you know, there's differences in Hispanic and there's differences in Asians, and obviously Dr. Fabian's and the, you know, NAMS and women, Healthy Women's Survey kind of showed that the extension to, you know, of this particular symptom dramatically, either in duration or severity, is really impacted by ethnicity. And I think that's an important thing when we think about, what is the value of coming up with treatments for people that are notoriously underserved? And if there's an option for that, should that be a greater priority then?
I'm just going to play devil's advocate a little bit though. So are we saying that having another option is going to, that Black or Hispanic or Latinx women are going to preferentially take a non-hormonal option because it's available. And I don't think that's necessarily the right thing either. Go ahead.
No, that's,
I was just gonna
That's-
say, particularly if it's really expensive.
Exactly.
Thank
I think we're making, yeah, I think there's a little bit of a dangerous assumption in there. And I would also put out the other group I'm concerned about that isn't using hormone therapy adequately, and that's the younger women, those women who go through premature menopause, particularly under 40. And are they going to say, or their doctor is going to say, hey, here's a non-hormone option that you don't have to take, when we know there are definite benefits for hormone therapy for those women? And is there now going to be a preferential shift for those women who really should have hormone therapy to this non-hormonal medication? So I think there's some concerns out there if we are inferring that this is somehow superior or a better option for a lot of people.
we're going to come back to that in the policy roundtable too, in terms of how this gets rolled out and communicated around the different options. Alan, you had your hand up, I think.
I was just going to add to this conversation that certainly the discussion around variation and how treatment may affect disparities along for different racial and ethnic groups in terms of the prevalence and acuity of disease. It was also mentioned several times that regardless of race and ethnicity, there are other social needs and financial needs that are impacted, like, presenteeism, absenteeism, the ability to maintain work and finish your career, that I would also factor into a conversation around health equity, so it's not that it's broadly applied, not just limited to a particular racial or ethnic background.
Thank you. Paula, did you have something else you wanted to add on?
Oh, he just added it. Thank you.
He did. Good. All right. So this is my chance to say again that what seems like a simple voting question is actually a tangled web of issues. And we're actually working on different ways to change this voting question as we head into our approach next year. We have it here today, and I'm glad you guys brought in these different questions and perspectives on it, but we'll go ahead and go back to the voting question now and ask you to take a vote, given all of that complexity. Given society's goal of reducing health inequities or health disparities, and thinking about the relative effects of fezolinetant versus no treatment, do we think that having fezolinetant would have everything from a major negative to a major positive effect on our ability to achieve that goal? Just waiting for one more vote, I think. There we go. Thank you. All right. And we've got start at 1 again, which is minor negative, 6 for no difference, 5 for minor positive. All right. So I think, again, it'll be important for us to note some of the complexities that you guys brought up as we relate this voting result in the report. All right. Thank you, guys. You did a great job. We're not going to vote on the long-term value for money. I know in a way it's kind of a shame not to, but we don't put the onus on the CEPAC to vote when we don't have from the company or from other sources a firm enough idea of what the launch price will be. So in this case, we had the cost effectiveness model. We talked about it. It'll be in the report. The model itself will be on the ICER Analytics platform so that people can go back in and plug in the price when it comes out, or their price and other assumptions or new data. But for now, we're going to pass on this voting question. And that means we have an extra 5 minutes of our break before we start the policy roundtable. So I'll just give, again, a very brief promo, which is policy roundtable. We're going to come back and we're going to talk right out of the gate around, what are clinicians and clinical experts and patients going to do if fezolinetant is available? What are the guidelines going to look like? How and when will they come up with new guidance? What is the advertising going to look like to patients and clinicians? And then we'll get into kind of the insurer kind of considerations around when will they provide coverage and under what language will they create criteria for eligibility for coverage for patients. We'll talk about future research and a couple other things as well. So coming back at 3 o'clock, we'll be joined by a representative from the company, the manufacturer, as well as representatives from the payer community, our clinical experts and patient experts, and we'll start right at the top of the hour. See you then.